All the Young Dudes, James's Perspective by Staying Dreams. Chapter 12. First year, Christmas 1971. Lupin, perhaps you can tell me, what are the transfigurative properties of lapis philosophorum? Professor McGonagall's voice cut through the quiet of the classroom, near the tail end of their afternoon lesson. From her position at the front of the room, she fixed Remus with a piercing look from behind her square spectacles, clearly expecting an answer to a question that wasn't even on the syllabus yet. James, sitting beside Remus at the wooden desk, nudged his mate with an elbow. "Wake up, Moony," James thought, his eyes darting toward Remus's ink-stained parchment, just in case his friend required a reminder to glance down at his hidden notes. But Remus didn't require a rescue. Remus hesitated for a second, his fingers shifting his quill before he answered in his usual steady cadence. "It's the one that turns things into gold, I think, if you use it right anyway. And Cleopatra, the alchemist, used it to turn lead into silver, if I remember correctly." James adjusted his spectacles, his eyebrows shooting up towards his messy fringe. Flipping heck! Where did he pull that from? James wondered, stunned. He'd spent the last 20 minutes doodling snitch trajectories on his textbook margin, oblivious to silver-making techniques. McGonagall's stern expression softened, though her surprise was barely concealed beneath her tight features. "Correct. 5 points to Gryffindor. And another 5 for making the connection to Cleopatra the alchemist. She's not mentioned in the Transfiguration for Beginners. Did you read that in your history text?" Remus offered a small nod, looking embarrassed by the spotlight of the classroom. James stared at his mate, half impressed by the bloke's massive brain and half bewildered by how someone could actually read ahead in history of magic without passing out from pure boredom. "Well, excellent," McGonagall continued, turning her sharp gaze to address the rest of the class. "Some of my third-year students are incapable of cross-referencing their studies like that. I'm pleased to see you taking such an interest." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the row of desks. "And we will begin discussing alchemy after Christmas. Which reminds me, with the holidays approaching, I'd like to ask any students planning to remain at Hogwarts over the break to let me know by the end of next week. Thank you, you're dismissed." As the rest of the first years began a chaotic flurry of packing up their brass scales and parchment, James clapped Remus on the back. "Nicely done, Lupin," James said, a tone of admiration ringing in his voice. Remus mumbled something incoherent in reply, gathering his inkpot while looking far more uncomfortable with the praise than anything else. "Mr. Lupin, if you have a moment," McGonagall's voice called out over the scrape of chairs, just as Remus was about to follow James out into the corridor. His curiosity piqued. "What's the old bird want with him?" he wondered, his protective instincts flaring. He lingered by the threshold, but McGonagall pointedly waited, standing as rigid as a statue, until the classroom had emptied off the other students before continuing. The delay left James with no choice but to loiter outside in the hallway. He leaned his shoulder against the stone wall, twirling his wand between his fingers with a restless energy. From the corner of his eye, James tracked the silhouettes of Sirius and Peter as they drifted down the intersecting hall. They were deep in an animated discussion about the tactical layout of the latest Gryffindor Quidditch match, their voices echoing off the high arches. James could have sprinted after them to join the conversation. He practically lived and breathed Quidditch, after all, but his boots stayed planted on the flagstones outside the Transfiguration door. He couldn't bring himself to abandon Remus to face the deputy headmistress alone. It was a hard-wired part of James's internal blueprint, always the one to wait behind, to guard the flank, and to ensure every member of his pack was all right before he moved on himself. As James continued the vigil outside the empty classroom, his attention was arrested by a familiar tableau playing out at the foot of the nearby staircase. Severus Snape was occupying the space too close to Lily Evans. The kid's black hair hung in limp curtains around his pale face as he leaned forward, their heads nearly touching as they conversed in quiet huddles. James couldn't help but roll his eyes, a sour taste invading his mouth. Flipping heck, he thought, crossing his arms over his scarlet jumper. What on earth can a brilliant girl like Lily possibly find intriguing in a total misery guts like Snape? The bloke was perpetually sulking through the draftier corridors of the castle, looking as though he hadn't encountered a bar of soap or a proper bath in a fortnight, and yet here he was, practically breathing down her neck. The infusion of moonstone powder at precisely the right moment creates an unparalleled transformative effect, Severus was saying, his low voice dripping with desperate intensity that made James want to throw up his school lunch. It's a subtle yet fascinating process, don't you think, Lily? Lily offered a nod, her bright green eyes tracking the conversation with interest. It does sound interesting, Seth. You really know your stuff when it comes to potions. James made a face, sticking his tongue out and mimicking a gagging motion behind the bags. Potions prodigy. My left foot, James thought, his jaw clenching. What was Snivellus playing at, putting on this ridiculous performance just to gain an audience with her? And why on earth was Lily entertaining the rubbish spilling out his mouth? He watched them with narrowed eyes, a sharp pang detonating in the center of his chest. He brushed the feeling aside, his inner monologue defensive. It's not jealousy, he told himself. Definitely not. I don't even know her like that. It was more an act of public service, concern for Lily's social standing. She was far too clever and vibrant to be watching her break times associating with the likes of a dungeon dweller. James's attention sharpened as a Hufflepuff student approached the pair, a roll of parchment held out like a shield as they clearly prepared to ask a question. The reaction was instantaneous. Snape's pale expression darkened into something ugly, and he snapped at the poor kid with a cutting coldness that echoed off the stone steps. Can't you see we're having a conversation? Wait your turn. James's fingers tightened like a vice around the polished wood of his mahogany wand inside his pocket. Slimy little git, he thought, his protective instincts flaring. Trashing a classmate just because his delicate little ego was interrupted. How did Lily not see straight through that dynamic? The bloke was a bully in a black cloak. Lily, to her credit, looked unimpressed by the display. Her posture went rigid as she frowned at the boy beside her. Severus, there's no need to be so harsh. He just had a question. Snape backtracked his arrogant posture, folding into a pathetic submission as his tone softened into something sickeningly sweet. You're right, Lily. I get carried away sometimes. James nearly scoffed, a bitter laugh dying in his throat. What a bloody act, as if Snape was even capable of genuine human kindness without a transactional motive. But before James could step forward to intervene and rescue her from the conversation, something manifested that made his stomach lurch. Snape reached deep into the pages of his textbook, carefully pulling out a small pressed flower and handed it across the space to Lily. To James's horror, Lily's eyes lit up with a flash of surprise and delight as her small fingers took the fragile steam. Seth, it's beautiful, thank you, she said, her voice dropping into a warm register that James had never heard her use before. James felt a twist in his gut as he watched Lily beam at the greasy Slytherin. Bloody hell, he thought, his chest tightening as he adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles with a trembling hand. What was that look even about? It wasn't like he wanted her to look at him with that kind of soft, radiant expression. Well, all right, perhaps a small forbidden part of him of his mind did. But it was far more than that. He didn't trust a single breath that came out of Severus Snape's mouth, and he knew with a stubborn certainty that the kid didn't deserve that kind of beautiful smile from someone as magnificent as Lily Evans. The feeling refused to leave him, but continued gnawing at his insides even after Remus finally emerged from the Transfiguration classroom, looking slightly peaky around the goggles, but otherwise fine. Together the two boys made their way back up to the Gryffindor common room, but James's mind remained stranded at the foot of the stairs, tangled up in the image of that blasted pressed petal, and the soft, radiant way Lily had smiled when she took it from Snivellus. He doesn't deserve a look like that, James thought, his jaw tight as he climbed through the portrait hole. Not in a million years. As November dissolved into December, the castle was transformed into a winter wonderland. Garlands of holly and ivy were draped along the high corridors, and the indoor air became perfumed with the rich scent of pine needles and the promise of oncoming snow. James adored Christmas. He always had, right down to his boots. It wasn't merely a matter of presents, though the loot was admittedly fantastic, especially since Fleement and Euphemia made a point of ensuring everything on his extensive wish list appeared under the tree. No, for James it was something far grander. It was the warmth of Potter household, the laughter and the sense of belonging. The holidays at his parents' estate were always a massive affair filled with an endless stream of visiting family and friends. His mom bustling about the kitchen, ensuring everyone was stuffed to the brim, his dad's booming laughter echoing through every room. Unable to contain his enthusiasm, James had been babbling about his upcoming holiday plans for days on end. He had taken to regaling his mates with animated stories of past winters, from the year his dad had modified their winter gear to his mom's famous mince pies that James could easily consume by the dozen. Last year, Dad apparated us to this massive hole just outside London. Side-along operation is that weird, by the way. And he charmed the sledges so we wouldn't fall off. It was unbelievable how fast we went slam. Sirius snapped his library book shut with a bang, cutting James off mid-sentence. The noise echoed across the common room, where the fire was crackling in the hearth. Over on the rock, Remus and Peter had been engrossed in a game of gobstones, while James had been flipping through the latest Quidditch Monthly, not actually absorbing a word of the articles, but using the glossy pages as a convenient prop while he prattled on. "Do you mind?" Sirius snapped, fixing James with a glare that could have pierced dragon hide. "I'm trying to read." James fell silent, taken aback as if he'd just been struck by a freezing charm. On the floor, James and Remus paused their game and looked up, the ambient comfort of the room evaporating into a palpable tension. Sorry, mate," James mumbled, his voice dropping as a flush crept up his neck. He stared at his best mate, his sharp eyes analyzing the rigid irritation locking up Sirius's handsome features, the way his shoulders were hunched toward his ears, and the clench of his jaw. Then, like a bucket of lake water, the reality of the situation hit James square in the chest. "Merlin, I'm an absolute idiot," he thought, a wave of guilt replacing his festive cheer. Of course, Christmas wasn't exactly a season of peace, love, and joy in the suffocating halls of the House of Black. Sirius wasn't going home to booming laughter and enchanted sledges. He was going back to cold marble pureblood lectures and a family that treated him like a defect. James had been so blinded by his unfortunate life that he hadn't stopped to think for a second how all this festive talk might be twisting the knife in his best mate's side. "It's fine," Sirius muttered, his voice tight and clipped. though it was obvious to everyone in the room that it was anything but fine. Too loud to concentrate down here anyway. Without another word, he scooped up his library book from the table and marched across the common room, heading up the stone stairs toward the safety of their boys' dormitory. James stood still, his eyes riveted to the empty archway long after Sirius had disappeared. A sickening worry began to gnaw at his insides. He never snaps like that, James thought, his jaw clenching as he tossed his Quidditch magazine onto the side table. Sirius's sharp tongue was usually reserved for Slytherins or overbearing prefects, not his pack. James knew in an abstract way that his best mate had been dragged through hell and back by the psychotic hierarchy of the House of Black, especially whenever the holiday season rolled around, but he hadn't fully realized the depth of the damage until this moment. The realization made the crackling fire in the hearth feel cold. Later that night, long after the rest of the tower had drifted off into sleep, the soft rustle of the four-poster hangings signaled Sirius creeping across the cold floorboards. James didn't hesitate for a second. He shifted over against the mattress, lifting the velvet covers to let him into the bed. It had become an unwritten rule between them over the course of the first term, an unspoken system of defense, where they provided an anchor when the terrifying nightmares of suffocating family memories became too much to bear in the dark. Sirius settled under the thick walls, his frame rigid. Before James's racing mind could overthink the logistics of what to say, he blurted out into the shadows, "Look, I'm sorry about earlier." "No, I should be the one apologizing," Sirius interrupted, his voice carrying an strange friction that cut through the quiet room. "It's not your fault my family's awful. You have every right to be excited. I'll try to be less of a miserable git." A wave of relief washed over James, dispelling the guilt that had been sitting on his chest since the afternoon. He cracked a brilliant smile into the darkness, eager to steer them back onto familiar territory. "You're not a miserable git, Black. Well, not usually anyway," he teased, reaching out to ruffle Sirius's dark hair till it stuck out in every direction. "And for the record, I like your miserable git self just fine." Sirius let out a breathless laugh, a familiar sound that made James feel as though the universe had slid back onto its proper axis. The tension evaporated, leaving a comfortable silence to settle over the four-poster bed as the winter wind howled against the dormitory windows. James stared up at the dark canopy above them, listening to the steady rhythm of his best mate's breathing. He thought, not for the first time since boarding the Hogwarts Express in September, that he didn't have the slightest clue what he'd do without Sirius Black. Fleamont and Euphemia had given him a golden childhood, but out there in the real world, Sirius was the brother his soul had been waiting for. No matter how loud or crazy the world got, as long as they were holding the line together, James knew they were untouchable. James had always possessed an understanding that the festive season wasn't a particularly jolly or magical time of year for either Sirius or Remus. Therefore, in the spirit of injecting a bit of warmth into their lives, he had invited them both to spend the Christmas break with him at the Potter Manor. He had already mapped out the fortnight in his head. Late nights trading stories in front of the drawing room fire, mountains of his mom's cooking, and the three of them staying up until dawn plotting their next castle adventure. But his bubble of holiday enthusiasm was brutally and quickly dampened. Remus was the first to turn him down, a refusal that James had half expected given his mate's private nature. "I'd love to, James, honestly," Remus said, his amber eyes looking heavy with apology. "But I'm still technically under the care of my Muggle boys home. I need written permission to leave Hogwarts and, well, you know how it is." James offered a sympathetic nod, trying not to let the weight of his disappointment show on his face. It's an absolute joke, is what it is, James thought, his chest tightening with a sense of injustice. Remus was easily the most brilliant bloke he'd ever met, and it made James' blood run cold to think of him trapped under the bureaucracy of some Muggle institution, denied the freedom to spend Christmas with people who actually cared about him. Sirius, however, was the one James had truly been banking on rescuing. But even his brother-in-arms had to deliver a refusal, and the reason made James's blood boil with a terrifying heat. Bellatrix, that bloody bitch, had been feeding my parents information, Sirius explained, his voice dropping into a dark register that carried none of his usual schoolboy swagger. Apparently, I've disgraced them enough already. If I go to yours, it will only get worse. Sorry, mate. James could see right through the casual shrug Sirius was attempting to pull off, but the pain behind those blue eyes was impossible to mask. They're suffocating him, James thought, his knuckles whitening as he fought back a wave of fury. Sirius didn't deserve to be locked away in that pure-blood mausoleum with that lot. The miserable aristocrats he was unfortunate enough to call a family. No, Rory's black, James said, forcing a smile as he clapped his best mate on the back, trying his best to inject some lightness into his voice. Well, just have to make up for it over the summer. On the last morning of the term, Remus walked all the way down to the frost-bitten edge of the grounds with the rest of the marauders to see them off. The Scarlet Engine's whistle was already echoing through the chilly December air. Plumes of white steam billowed around the platform, obscuring the castle in a misty haze. James scrambled up the metal steps of the carriage, throwing open the glass window and leaning his torso halfway out the biting cold. "We'll send you owls," James called out over the roaring din of the pistons, grinning down at the solitary boy on the platform. He shot Remus a wink. "See if you can come up with our next plan of attack on Snowvillers, yeah?" Remus smiled up at him, but it was a somewhat forced expression that didn't quite manage to reach his tired eyes. James felt a pang of cold hit him right in the stomach. The realization felt like a physical blow. It had to be bloody awful, the concept of having nowhere warm to go for Christmas. No bustling household filled with laughter, and no adulting family waiting at the station barriers to greet you with open arms. James quickly gave him a thumbs up as the train let out a massive shudder, and the carriage slowly started to pull away from the platform. But as the silhouette of his friend gradually shrunk against the snowy landscape, the lonely look in Remus's eyes stayed locked in James's mind, leaving the golden boy feeling crestfallen and cold. Sirius remained quiet for the vast majority of the long journey south. He kept himself anchored by the window, his blue eyes staring blankly out at the frost-bitten countryside, while his handsome expression stayed closed off from the rest of the carriage. James didn't push him. He knew better than anyone in Great Britain that when Sirius entered this unreachable state, it was best to let him be. Instead, James took it upon himself to maintain a stream of casual chatter with Peter, navigating topics with a tactical precision that avoided even the slightest mention of Christmas. It was a fine line to tread, the balance between being considerate of his best mate's trauma and making it obvious that he was being considerate. James tried his best to walk that tightrope, matching Peter's energy while keeping the atmosphere light enough to shield the brooding boy in the corner. Yet, as the Scarlet Engine rattled closer and closer to London, James could feel an uncontrollable excitement bubbling inside his chest. He wouldn't dare admit it aloud to the lads, not when Sirius was going back to a prison and Remus was left alone in a castle. But he had been missing his parents far more than he'd let on during the term. The thought of seeing them standing at the barrier, of stepping back inside the warmth of his home, filled him with a radiance that even the biting December wind rattling the carriage window couldn't touch. By the time the train finally pulled into King's Cross, his energy had completely taken over, and he was practically bouncing in his velvet seat. His parents were waiting on the crowded platform, and James's heart swelled with a surge of affection at the sight of them. Fleeman Potter stood as tall and imposing as ever, his wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose, radiating that booming presence that could fill a room. Beside him was Euphemia, with her silver-streaked curls and that warm smile that had always been the definition of comfort to James. Before they stepped off the train into the press of families, James turned to Sirius. He didn't hesitate, putting his best mate into a hug, punctuated by the squeeze of Sirius's shoulder. They didn't require any words between them. James simply forced all of his loyalty into his stare, hoping his eyes conveyed the silent vow he wanted to say. "I'm here whenever you need me, Sirius, always, no matter what that house does to you." Sirius offered a nod, a silent promise of his own, before he stepped down onto the platform and disappeared into the sea of dark cloaks. James watched his brother go, a knot of worry tightening in the center of his chest. "Don't let them break you, Black," he thought. But he was pulled out of the dark thoughts when a familiar scent of sweet orange and rich clove enveloped him. His mother's arms wrapped around his neck, pulling him into a tight embrace that smelled of home. "Oh, James," Euphemia murmured, her voice brimming with love as she began kissing him all over his face, ignoring his laughing protests. She pulled back slightly, her small hand still resting on his shoulders, as she inspected her only son. "You're far too thin. Haven't you been eating properly? And your glasses, James." James grinned sheepishly, his cheeks turning a bright pink as his hum reached up and took the spectacles off his nose. The frames had cracked during a wrestling match with Sirius in the Gryffindor common room the week before, and James hadn't bothered to waste his time fixing them yet. Before he could offer a witty reply, his dad's thunderous laugh rang out across the platform, shattering any lingering tension from the journey. The next thing James knew, the world tilted on its axis. He was lifted clean off the ground and wrapped in his father's strong arms. "Of course he's been eating, Effie," Fleeman declared, hoisting James onto his broad shoulders as though he were still a 7-year-old kid running around the gardens. "You will remember the feast at Hogwarts. His glasses are an easy fix. He's just been getting rough with the other lads, I reckon." "Yeah, it was serious," James exclaimed from his high perch, throwing his best mate under the bus to defend himself. "We were wrestling, but not in a violent way," he quickly added, shooting his mom a look that was meant to be reassuring. Effie shook her head in exasperation. She pulled her wand from her ropes and muttered a repairing charm under her breath, the glass clicking back into perfect alignment. She placed the spectacles gently back onto his nose, patting his cheek with a tender smile. "You foolish boy." James laughed, feeling lighter and warmer than he had in weeks. His mom's relentless fussing, his dad's booming laughter, this untouchable security was what Christmas was supposed to be about. "Let's go home now," Fleeman announced. Without another word, his dad took off down the bustling platform in a jog, James still perched on his shoulders. Both of them laughed through the winter chill, looking for all the world like they didn't have a care in the universe. The Potter Manor exuded a rich warmth the second James, Euphemia, and Fleeman crossed the threshold. It was a heavy sort of heat, the kind that speeded through a bloke's winter robes into his bones until every muscle went slack. The air was perfumed with the scent of evergreen boughs and the sharp spice of cinnamon. Over in the main sitting room, a log fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting a golden glow across the polished furniture, while charmed fairy lights twinkled along the ceiling like stars. The moment they dropped his school trunk, Euphemia enveloped James in another tight hug, her dark eyes shining with a maternal affection. Oh, my boy, she murmured into his messy hair, holding him against her chest as if she never wanted to let him go back to Scotland. It's so wonderful to have you home for Christmas break. James grinned into her shoulder, inhaling the familiar essence of his childhood. Nothing competes with this, James thought, a surge of contentment washing over him. No matter how magnificent the high towers of Hogwarts were, or how much fun he had running the corridors with Sirius, there was nothing on earth like being anchored by his parents. Fleeman clapped him on the back, a proud smile stretching across his weathered face. We missed you, James. How's Hogwarts treating you? James pulled back from his mom's embrace, adjusting his spectacles to give his dad a wide grin. It's been incredible, Dad. You wouldn't believe the stuff we've learned. Magic is just brilliant. Euphemia laughed, the sound every bit as warm as the enchanted room they were standing in. I'm sure it is, dear. Now, let's get you settled in. Dinner will be ready soon. James's stomach let out a loud growl at the mention of food, earning a synchronized chuckle from his parents. He followed them into the flagstone kitchen, where the aroma of a home-cooked meal greeted his senses like an old friend. His mom had outdone herself for his return. There was a staggering feast laid out across the wooden table, featuring every one of James's favorite dishes. There was a roast beef, glistening in its juices, heaps of mashed potatoes, Yorkshire puddings that looked so tall they were about to topple over, and a silver gravy boat the size of a small cauldron. As they gathered around the table, the Potters slipped back into the easy rhythm of family life. Laughter filled the room, and James found himself regaling his parents with tales from his first term. His hands gestured wildly as he described the magical creatures he'd encountered, the euphoria of his first flying lessons, and, of course, the pranks. There were always pranks. James's mind was buzzing as he explained the layouts of their parlor tricks, though he omitted any details that might involve the Forbidden Forest or illegal nighttime wanderings. Fleeman chuckled, his brown eyes twinkling behind his glasses with an expression of amusement. Sounds like you're having quite the adventure, son. Any trouble with those pranks of yours? James tried to execute his most convincing look of innocence, though the defensive effect was ruined by the grin tugging at the corners of his lips. Just a bit, Dad, but it's all in good fun, I promise. You'd be proud. I'm making a name for Gryffindor. Euphemia shot her son a look that straddled the line between maternal gravity and fond amusement. Just remember to keep it within reason, James. We don't want any more owls from Professor McGonagall about misbehavior. James flashed her a sheepish smile, though he couldn't quite suppress the laugh that escaped his throat. As if Minnie could ever truly stay mad at us, he thought, remembering the exasperated but faintly impressed look on the Transfiguration professor's face after their last stunt. Out loud, he quickly assumed his most youthful expression. No more owls, I promise, Mom. The cozy winter evening wore on delightfully. Once the table was cleared, the trio migrated into the warmth of the living room, settling into the plush armchairs positioned by the roaring fire. James's dad handed him a steaming mug of hot chocolate topped with a mountain of cream. They all sat there in bliss, basking in the golden glow of the flames, trading stories and simply soaking in each other's presence. To James, there was something magical about the atmosphere. This sense of being home, cocooned by the two people who understood his frequency and loved him best in the world. But as much as James's pride tried to fight off his mounting exhaustion, the warmth of the hearth and the comforting weight of his dinner began to make his eyelids drop like lead weights. After his third yawn, his parents exchanged a knowing smile across the rug. I think it's time for bed, love, Euphemia said, her soft voice sounding gentle but non-negotiable. James tried to protest the curfew, hopping up to his feet with a surge of renewed energy to prove he was still wide awake. "But I haven't even told you about my friends yet." Fleeman chuckled, settling further back into his favorite armchair near the crackling logs, his spectacles glinting in the firelight. "We're all ears, son. Tell us everything." That was all the invitation James required. He launched into a series of tales about the Marauders, his chest expanding as he described each of his roommates with a reverence that only stemmed from true brotherhood. His brown eyes lit up behind his glasses as he began with their quietest member. "He's bloody brilliant, Mom. So clever. Always got a plan up his sleeves, even if he's a bit quiet sometimes." James smiled, fondly thinking of how Remus could dismantle a complex library text in seconds. Euphemia listened intently, a soft expression gracing her features, clearly pleased to her core that her only son had managed to find such mates. "And Peter, he's always making us laugh. Bit clumsy, but he's got a heart of gold," James added, his enthusiasm bubbling over as he gestured with his mug. Fleeman chuckled again, taking a sip of his drink. "Sounds like a well-rounded group of friends." James nodded, his heart hammering with pride, as he prepared to introduce the most vital piece of his cast alive. "And of course, there's Sirius Black." His voice took on a tone of pride and affection. "He's my best mate, Dad. We've got plans to make Hogwarts history together." The moment the surname left his lips, the warmth in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. Euphemia and Fleeman exchanged a swift glance, a silent communication that James's sharp eyes did not miss. A flicker of concern clouded his parents' expression, though they both tried to mask the tension with practiced efficiency. James's grip tightened on his mug. "They're thinking of his family," he realized with a prickle of heat in his chest. "They are thinking of the dark magic and the notorious pureblood fanatics." Fleeman, ever the optimist, quickly forced a reassuring smile back onto his face. "Sirius Black, you say? Well, it sounds like you've made some strong bonds. Friends are an important part of life, James." Euphemia's tone remained gentle, but there was a sharpness lingering in her dark eyes that made James pause right in his tracks. "We trust your judgment, sweetheart. Just remember to surround yourself with good influences." James sensed the shift in the atmosphere, a subtle tension that hadn't been present a minute prior. He looked between his parents, his jaw setting with a fierce loyalty as he sought to obliterate their hidden worries. They don't know him, James thought. They don't know how much he hates the doghouse. "Don't worry, Mom, Dad. Sirius is loyal. We've got each other's back." Fleeman reached over across the space and ruffled James's messy hair, his pride clear despite the lingering shadow. "That's what we like to hear, son. Hogwarts is a place for making memories and forging lasting friendships. Just make sure those friendships bring out the best in you." Euphemia leaned down from her seat and pressed a kiss to James's forehead, her eyes soft with love and something else, something protective. "We're proud of the young wizard you're becoming, James. Hogwarts has a way of shaping character, and we're excited to see the man you'll grow into." James couldn't help but feel a swell of warmth expand in his chest at their declaration. He loved his boys down to his marrow, but there was something intoxicating about knowing his parents were proud of the person he was becoming. When he crawled between the blankets of his bed, a short while later, the comforting essence of the manor surrounded him like an anchor. He could practically feel his parents' love wrapping around his frame like a second quilt. "Sleep well, James," his mom whispered into the shadows of the bedroom, her cool fingers gently smoothing his wild hair back from his brow. "Dream of magic and adventures. Hogwarts is your second home, but remember, this is your first home, and we're always here for you." His dad's deep voice came next, a low rumble that vibrated through the dark room. "Good night, son. We love you." James slowly drifted off into a deep slumber, feeling the support of his family sitting on his chest like a comforting weight. But just before the final wave of unconsciousness claimed his mind, a prickle of worry crept into his thoughts. What had that warning look between his parents truly meant? Why did they look so frightened the second he mentioned Sirius? He'd never seen his parents react to a simple name with such concern before. But the luxury of his mattress and the exhaustion of the long travel day soon pulled him under the surface, causing his racing thoughts to fade into contentment of being home. The initial week back from Scotland dissolved into a whirlwind of festive excitement, and the Potter estate was buzzing with Christmas cheer. Euphemia and James threw themselves into transforming the grand living room into a holiday wonderland, and within days the space was glowing with seasonal spirit. Twinkling fairy lights snaked around the wall panels, garlands of holly and tinsel hung from every mantelpiece, and the towering Christmas tree was a sight to behold. It stood in the corner, decked out in a myriad of glass ornaments, each one catching the light more dazzlingly than the last. The house smelled of cinnamon and fresh pine, thick, warm, and comforting. James was in his element. He stood on his tiptoes, his wire-rimmed spectacles slipping down his nose as he carefully hung a silver bauble onto one of the lower branches. The ornament caught the dancing light from the fireplace, reflecting it back into the room in bursts of gold. He spun around to face his mom, unable to contain his excitement bouncing around his chest. "Mom, do you think we could invite Sirius to our Christmas party? It wouldn't be the same without him." He'd already sent off an owl to Peter, and though it broke his heart that Remus was stuck within the castle walls for the holidays, there was still a chance that Sirius could join the festivities, even if it was just for one night. Surely the Lord and Lady Black could spare their eldest son for a few hours of holiday fun. Euphemia, who was busy adjusting a tangled string of lights near the window, paused her work and smiled with immense warmth at her son. "Oh, James, I know how much you enjoy Sirius's company. It's wonderful that you have such a good friend." James grinned, his brain already racing with the logistics of having Sirius there. "He's the best, Mom. We could show him the magic tricks you taught me, and he could even help us with the decorations. He's got a good eye for it, you know." In his mind, James could picture Sirius laughing by the hearth, stripped of that rigid posture he always wore whenever his family was mentioned. James wanted to share the luxury of a Potter Christmas with the bloke who had quickly become his brother. But as he reached for another ornament, James's sharp eyes caught a shift in his mom's expression. Euphemia's smile faltered slightly at the edges. She stepped away from the window and knelt down on the rock beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. There was a hint of sadness lingering in her dark eyes, a look that James, sheltered by a lifetime of affection, didn't quite understand. "Sweetheart, I appreciate how much you care about your friends," Euphemia said softly. "But, you see, there are some things that, well, it's not always easy to explain." James furrowed his brow, a mixture of curiosity and confusion, battling it out in his chest. "Why not, Mom? Sirius is nice, and he'd love to come, I'm sure of it." Euphemia let out a quiet sigh, her gaze drifting toward the fire as she reached for words that wouldn't shatter her son's innocent view of the rules. "It's not about whether Sirius is nice or not, James. Sometimes grown-ups have rules and expectation that children might not fully understand. The Blacks have certain beliefs, and well, inviting Sirius might not be the best idea." James's brow furrowed even deeper, his stomach dropping slightly as he tried to mentally parse her warning. It didn't seem fair at all. Rules? Beliefs? What did pure-blood politics have to do with mince pies and holiday party? "But why, Mom?" James pressed, his voice rising. He's my best friend. Euphemia met his brown gaze, her expression a mix of sorrow and empathy. James, it's not about you or Sirius. It's about respecting the rules of other families. I know it's hard to understand, but there are things we must consider to keep the peace and show kindness, even when it's difficult. James felt a twinge of disappointment detonate in his chest. Like a crack breaking through the excitement he'd been floating on all week. It was his first taste of the invisible barriers that divided the visiting world. Okay, Mom, James mumbled, looking down at the glass bauble in his hand. He didn't want to argue with her, but every fibre of his soul rejected the logic. I guess I understand, but it's not fair. His mom pulled him into a hug, the familiar scent of cloves enveloping him and soothing the sting of his rejection. Life isn't always fair, my love, she whispered into his ear, rubbing his back. But we can still make the best of it and enjoy the time we have with those we care about. Now, let's finish decorating, and we'll make the Christmas party one to remember, even without Sirius. James nodded against her shoulder, but as they returned to decking the walls of the manor, he couldn't quite shake the sense of longing for Sirius's presence. His mom's warnings continued to echo in his mind. Though he trusted her completely, the conversation left him feeling unsettled and unanchored. For the first time in his 11 years, James began to puzzle out the dark architecture of the world outside his home. Sirius's family, the obsession with pure blood lineage, and the widening chasm between people like the Blacks and Muggle-borns like Lily Evans. It dawned on his mind that the world wasn't as simple or kind as he'd believed. There were layers to it, complications he'd never been forced to think about while flying his toy broomstick in the safety of the back gardens. He continued hanging the ornaments, but his thoughts were 1,000 miles away, locked inside a grim house with Sirius. He wondered what his best mate would say if he knew about this conversation. Black would probably deflect it, masking the blow with something wicked, witty and a bit cheeky. But James knew that there would be quiet hurt hidden in those blue eyes too. James loathed the thought of Sirius spending the winter holiday trapped in the dark swamp with people who didn't possess the capacity to appreciate how brilliant, loyal, and magnificent he truly was. But James also recognized that his mom meant well. She was his protector, trying to shield the family from the crosshairs of the dark factions, ensuring everything stayed as peaceful as possible. And so, with a small sigh, James adjusted his spectacles and resolved that he'd make this Christmas as magnificent as he possibly could. For his parents, for Pete, and for Sirius, even if his brother was separated from him by miles of cold stone. He'd find a way to make it up to Sirius over the spring term, he promised himself. After all, if there was one truth he had learned during his first 4 months at Hogwarts, it was that the Marauders always held the line for each other, no matter what the rest of the world threw at them. Friday, 23rd December 1971. Diagon Alley was buzzing with the sort of holiday cheer that you could almost feel against your skin like a spark from a goblet of fire. The cobbled thoroughfare was packed to the brim, but in the best possible way. Witches and wizards staring from shop to shop, arms piled high with paper parcels, their faces lit up with the radiant joy of only Christmas could conjure. The scent of sugar plums and roasted chestnuts melted into the crisp winter air. James couldn't help but feel a bit giddy as he navigated through the crush, flanking Peter while his dad led the charge. Fleemint, executing his relentlessly organized approach to life, had a long list of last-minute Christmas errands clutching in his hand. Right, James, his dad said, navigating the snow-dusted street with a determined stride. We need to stop by Madame Pimpernel's for your aunt's Christmas present. Then we'll swing by Ollivander's for that special wand polish your mother's after. Oh, and don't let me forget the enchanted mistletoe for the entryway. Peter, looking as though he were treating this shopping expedition with the same gravity as a transfiguration exam, nodded along eagerly. Yes, Mr. Potter, I've got it all written down, sir. As they needed the frosted windows of Madame Pimpernel's beautifying potions, James's eyes couldn't stop darting around, taking in the festive decorations gracing every shop front. Diagon Alley always looked magnificent, but at Christmas time it felt as though the wizarding street had been struck by an euphoric enchantment. He turned to his dad, his energy bubbling over. Dad, do you think we could pop into Quality Quidditch Supplies? I want to get serious a little something for Christmas. Fleeman grinned down at him, his spectacles glinting in the winter sun as he ruffled James's untidy hair. Of course, son. A Quidditch gift sounds like a brilliant idea. But let's be quick about it. We've got quite a list to get through. James and Peter dashed through the threshold of Quality Quidditch Supplies like they were sprinting the final lap of race, the brass bell above the door chiming. Their eyes were instantly drawn to the velvet-lined display stands showcasing the new Corfles on offer. James picked one up, the rich scent of cured leather hitting his nose as he turned the scarlet spur over in his hands. He could already visualize the expression of shock and delight that would take over Sirius's face when he ripped open the packaging. This will show him he's still part of the pack, no matter how his awful mother says, James thought. This one's perfect, James declared, holding it up, and Peter nodded in agreement. The festive atmosphere of the alley seemed to wrap itself around them like a thick cloak, multiplying the excitement of the holidays. But even as they checked off the fragrant contours of Madame Pimpernel's and retrieved the wand polish from Ollivander's, James found himself distracted by a nagging thought that refused to leave him alone. He hadn't yet managed to track down the perfect gift for Remus. It was a problem that sat heavily in his stomach. During the first month in the dormitory, James's sharp eyes had noted that Remus's school robes always looked just a bit too frayed at the cuffs, a bit too thin for the Scottish winter, and rapidly becoming far too small for the boy's sudden growth spurts. He's too proud to ask for anything, James mused, his jaw tightening as they stepped back out into the snow. But he's a marauder now. I'm not letting him freeze while the rest of us are stuffed with turkey. Dad, Pete, I'm just going to run over to Madame Malkin's real quick. I'll catch up with you in a bit, James said, already shifting his weight and half jogging in that direction before his dad could even check the list. Stepping through the threshold of Madame Malkin's robes for all occasions was like breaching a different world, a sanctuary of heavy fabrics and warm colors where everything was arranged and inviting. James began browsing the wooden racks, his heart light with anticipation as he pictured the look of shock on Remus's face when he unfolded a brand new set of winter wools. He selected a few everyday robes that his eye deemed a perfect match for Remus's lanky frame, feeling a hum of pride at the prospect of looking after his mate. Gathering the substantial armful of black fabric against his chest, James made his way toward the row of changing cubicles at the back of the shop, intending to hold them up to a mirror to judge the length. He pushed aside the velvet curtain to what he assumed was an unoccupied area, only to find himself standing face to face with the startled Marlene McKinnon. "Whoa, sorry about that," James stammered, a flush of embarrassment rushing up his neck, and his cheeks heated up. He shoved back a half step, clutching the bundle of ropes like a shield. "Didn't mean to barge in like that." Marlene's eyes widened in surprise, but she quickly smoothed down her half-pinned school robes and offered him an amused half-smile. "It's fine. Just give me a warning next time, yeah?" James scratched the back of his head, a sheepish grin spreading across his face as he tried to regain his footing. Right, got it. James Potter, by the way. Marlene McKinnon, she replied. The tone was curt, but her sharp eyes were appraising him from beneath her fringe, as if she were weighing up whether he was a public menace or just a colossal idiot. They both knew each other's names. Of course, Hogwarts was a small castle, and it was practically impossible not to recognize every face in their own year. But it wasn't as though they'd ever sat down for a proper conversation. The facts James knew about Marlene was sparse. She belonged to Gryffindor, she hung out with Lily Evans, and she seemed a great deal quieter and more reserved than the rest of the tower. An awkward silence descended over the changing cubicle. Usually, James was a master of filling the dead ear with chatter, but under the scrutiny of Evan's best mate, he found himself lost for words. So, Marlene, he started, floundering quite a bit as he shifted the heavy fabrics in his arms. What brings you to Madame Malkin's today? New robes for the spring term? Brilliant, Potter, James thought, mentally kicking himself the second words left his mouth. What an absolute dunce. What else would a girl be doing inside a tailor's shop? Buying cauldrons? Marlene raised an eyebrow, clearly picking up on the obvious nature of his question. Something like that. Fortunately, James was saved from his social awkwardness by the thought of the noble mission that had driven him into the shop in the first place. He hoisted the bundle of fine garments higher against his chest, his pride returning in a surge. Well, I'm here for a friend, he explained, his tone warming as he thought of the boys back in the dormitory. Remus Lupin. He usually gets hand-me-downs, so I thought I'd surprise him with something fresh. Something in Marlene's expression shifted then, the awareness giving way to something softer and more curious. She looked down at the mountain of black fabric piled in his arms. That's thoughtful of you. James grinned, feeling a surge of his usual confidence rush back into his chest. Finally, he thought, glad to be out of the conversational doghouse. Yeah, well, we're a tight-knit bunch, the Marauders. He couldn't help but feel a thrill at dropping the group's title into a conversation with an outsider for the first time. It felt official. It felt powerful. Got to look out for each other, you know? Before Marlene could offer a response, the changing room curtain rustled again, and Peter poked his round head into the narrow space. Hey, James, I couldn't find you, mate. Oh, hi there, Pete added, his eyes widening slightly as he noticed the girl standing by the mirrors. Pete, meet Marlene McKinnon. Marlene, this is Peter Pettigrew, James introduced smoothly, feeling at ease now that his flank was covered by one of his roommates. Peter offered a polite smile, shifting his feet against the floorboards. Nice to meet you, Marlene. Marlene returned the gesture with a smile. Likewise, Peter. The three of them stood there, chatting for a bit, trading observations about their first term at Hogwarts, and laughing over the latest gossip flittering through the castle corridors. Marlene, who had seemed so standoffish and prickly when he had first ruined her privacy, gradually warmed up to the two boys. She possessed a quick wit that surprised James, and he found himself laughing at her sarcastic humor. She's proper good value, this one, James mused, approving of her vibe. He couldn't help but note with a sense of relief that she didn't make him feel self-conscious, tongue-tied, and defensive, the way Lily Evans so effortlessly managed to do whenever he breathed in her direction. Marlene felt easy to talk to, straightforward, no nonsense, and like someone he could see himself being mates with in the common room. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marlene's dad, who appeared in the cubicle doorway with a relaxed smile. Marley, ready to go? He called out. Marlene's eyes lit up with affection, and she nodded quickly, turning back to James and Peter to wrap things up. Yeah, Dad, this is James and Peter. We were just chatting. Mr. McKinnon, who possessed the same sandy blonde hair as his daughter, extended a hand to both James and Peter in turn. James's sharp eyes tracked the man's attire. His clothes had a bit of a Muggle flair to them. "Nice to meet you both," the man said warmly. As they exchanged pleasantries, James couldn't help but feel a sense of camaraderie settling over the small space. Marlene was funny, sharp as a new cool, and he was glad they'd accidentally run into each other over the clothing racks. As she and her dad turned to head out of the bustling shop into the Diagon Alley snow, James called after her with a cheeky grin. "Until next time, Molly." Marlene chuckled softly, giving him a wave over her shoulder as they cleared the exit. James watched the glass door swing shut behind them, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles with a content smile. He thought to himself that maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't be a bad thing to run into her again when the spring term commenced. After all, a marauder could never have too many allies in the tower. Saturday, the 24th December, 1971. The Porter family's Christmas Eve party was the sort of magical affair that made a bloke feel as though he'd stepped into the heart of a snow globe. The kind where colors glowed a little brighter and the air felt warmer. The drawing room was bathed in the amber radiance of the massive fireplace, while thousands of enchanted fairy lights danced around the pine tree, casting a golden halo over the room. It was a scene that could only manifest in a household saturated with the abundance of love and a dose of ancient family magic. Laughter echoed off the stone walls, mingling with the mouth-watering scent of cinnamon, gingerbread, and the spicy tang of festive cider. Wizarding carols hummed softly in the background, keeping a comforting frequency that served as a reminder that it was officially Christmas and everything in James's universe was exactly as it ought to be. Amidst the bustle of eccentric aunts and old family friends, James had managed to carve out a quiet little corner by the velvet drapes with Peter. They had both piled their porcelain plates high with a mountain of sugar plums, mince pies, and cauldron cakes, which they were currently working their way through. James adjusted his spectacles, his brown eyes twinkling with the reflection of the fairy lights as he glanced around the crowded room with a satisfied grin. "Can you believe it, Pete? Christmas at the Potters. It's always something special, isn't it?" Peter nodded quickly, a dollop of vanilla icing tugging at the corner of his lips as his round eyes swept over the glittering decorations. "Yeah, it's brilliant, James. Thanks for inviting me." A surge of affection for his roommate washed over James's chest. Peter always looked so chuffed whenever he was included in the Potter family dynamics, looking as though it were the greatest privilege in the wizarding world just to be sitting here on the rug. But as James tracked the steam rising from a nearby punch bowl, a shadow of a thought crossed his mind, dimming his smile just a touch. Black should be here, tearing into the roast, James thought with a prickle of resentment. And Lupin shouldn't be sitting in a draughty empty castle. Unable to keep the protectiveness locked away, he sighed softly. "You know, I can't help but think how much Sirius and Remus would love this. Wish they could be here too." Peter's eager smile wavered, dropping into a small line, and James felt a pang of guilt. "I thought you were having a great time with just me here, James," Peter mumbled, his shoulders hunching inwards as he looked down at his half-eaten cauldron cake. James was quick to shake his head, dropping his mince pie back onto his plate and leaning his shoulder in to give Peter a nudge. Playful but sincere. "Bollocks, I've gone and insulted Pete," James thought, eager to repair the fracture. "Oh, Pete, I am. You know that. It's just, well, you know how it is. Christmas doesn't feel quite right without the whole gang, does it? Peter offered a small nod, but James' sharp eyes did miss the flicker of disappointment that remained pinned in his friend's gaze. Peter wasn't always the easiest bloke to reach on the surface, but he possessed a knack for making a person feel as though they'd forgotten something important, even when they hadn't meant a bit of malice. "Yeah, I get it," Peter said with a soft chuckle, shifting his plate. "Maybe next year they'll be here too." James clapped Peter on the back. "Absolutely, mate. We'll make it happen." He grinned, a spark igniting behind his wire-rimmed glasses as his jaw set. No pure-blood family politics or institutional rules were going to keep his pack divided forever. "We'll have the best Christmas yet, all of us together. And who knows, maybe we'll even get Sirius to put on one of Mom's Christmas jumpers." Peter snorted loudly, a stray crumb flying off his plate, and James felt the cloud of melancholy lift from the corner as they shared a laugh. "Now that," Peter said with a chuckle, shaking his head, "would be something worth seeing." James grinned widely, picturing the absurdity of the scene in his mind. Sirius, with the haughty air of rebellion, looking ridiculous while wrapped up in a thick, hand-knitted festive jumper. Remus standing by the mantelpiece, rolling his amber eyes in that fond way he always did whenever they lost their minds, and Peter looking as pleased as Punch just to be part of the madness. It was a magnificent thought. As James looked around the beautiful room again, a sense of certainty settled in his gut. Next year they would make it happen. No matter what obstacles the wizarding world threw at them, that was what the Marauders did. They tore down the rules and made things happen together. For the moment, however, James was content to sink back into the cushions and enjoy the evening with Peter and his flank, in a house overflowing with magic and Christmas cheer. And really, looking at his mate's face, it wasn't half bad. Not at all. Christmas morning broke over the Potter estate with a brilliant radiance, bathing the living room in a warm and inviting light. The indoor air was saturated with the rich scents of freshly baked mince pies warming in the kitchen and the piney aroma of the Christmas tree. Euphemia and Fleemont, clad in their festive pyjamas, awaited their son's arrival, their faces alight with the spirit of the season. James came bounding down the wooden stairs like a blotcher, his tousled dark hair sticking up in defiant tufts as though he just tumbled out of a wrestling match with his pillow. His brown eyes sparkled behind his spectacles with the excitement of Christmas morning. Yet, if his parents looked closely, a shadow of wistfulness lingered in their depths, a silent testament to the two members of his pack who were currently missing from his holiday. "Morning, Mom, Dad," James greeted, his grin wide enough to rival the winter sun. "Good morning, dear," Euphemia said, her voice full of emotion as she pulled him into an embrace. "Happy Christmas." "Happy Christmas, son," Fleemont added, stepping forward to give James a ruffle of his unruly hair. "Ready to see what Santa's left for you this year?" James chuckled, his enthusiasm lifting the veil of melancholy that had threatened his morning. "Absolutely." The small family gathered around the base of the Christmas tree, its boughs festooned with thousands of twinkling lights and glass ornaments that combined to create a scene pulled straight out of a wizarding fairy tale. Nestled beneath the low branches sat a massive pile of presents, each one wrapped in colorful paper. As they began the process of tearing into the packages, the room erupted with laughter and exclamations. Euphemia had custom-ordered a set of scarlet, Quidditch-themed pyjamas for James, featuring tiny snitches that buzzed across the flannel fabric. James held them up, declaring them to be the greatest piece of tailoring in Great Britain with a flourish. Fleement, meanwhile, unwrapped a new set of specialized magical shaving equipment, which he inspected with a mixture of amusement and satisfaction. Once the last of the bright pepper had been cleared away, the trio settled back around the crackling fire. Porcelain cups of hot cocoa held in their hands, the warmth radiating from the stone hearth, and the comfort of being tucked away together acted as a balm to James's restless soul. "Thanks, Mom, Dad. This has been amazing," James said softly, his smile genuine, heartfelt, and stripped of his usual cockiness. Euphemia reached across the space, giving his hand a squeeze. "We're so glad you're enjoying it, dear. Christmas is about being with the ones you love." Fleement nodded, his spectacles reflecting the orange glow of the logs. "And speaking of love, we've noticed you've been missing your friends. It's perfectly all right to feel that way. Hogwarts will be back before you know it, and you'll be reunited with them soon enough." James offered a nod, appreciating the kindness, emotional intelligence, and understanding radiating from his parents' words. They didn't patronize him. They understood his loyalty. "Yeah, I know, but being here with you both makes it special, too." As they sat together in contentment, James felt a sense of gratitude for the love and protection that surrounded his life. He was aware of how fortunate he was to have Fleement and Euphemia as his anchors, especially when his mind drifted back to his boys, who were not so lucky. Remus was waking up to an empty dormitory, and Sirius was enduring the suffocating silence of his family home. "It's not right," James thought, his jaw setting as he stared into his cocoa. The Potter's home was a wellspring of magic, security, and affection, and James decided then and there that there was more than enough gold in their lives to share. He refused to let his brothers spend another winter in the dark. Maybe he could figure out a way to weaponize the Christmas magic and ship it to Sirius and Remus, even if they were separated by hundreds of miles of cold British countryside. Because, in the end, James Potter knew that being a marauder meant that sharing your light was far more important than receiving it.